now it's time to move to the next speaker, and let me introduce briefly Professor Annette Baudisch. Annette Baudisch is professor at the Interdisciplinary Center of Population Dynamics of the University of Southern Denmark. Her research is about the advanced concepts, theories, and methods to study age patterns of mortality and fertility with a biodemographic perspective. She was honored by the Max Planck Society with the Otto Hahn Medal 2007 for outstanding scientific achievements, her formal distinction between the peace and the shape of aging, and earned the Trailblazer Award for demographic analysis and her research on the inevitable aging. Please, now Annette Baudisch presents a lecture titled Toward a Transdisciplinary Framework to Analyze Birth and Death Patterns. Okay, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm honored to be here today and speak for this distinguished audience. And I'm also still very inspired and excited by the previous talk of Professor Meng. And I can also see quite a number of connections, even though my talk will probably be a little bit of an outlier here. A little disclaimer, I am not a statistician. I still hope that I can tell you some interesting, new, exciting things. So with no further ado, no. Is it? It's not moving. There. Okay, so Professor Meng just said that we are not the same individual and equal one, but over time we actually go through different stages, we age. And this is basically what I will talk about in my talk, asking this question, why do we age? Why can we not stay young forever? If we would all stop aging right now, maybe some of us would actually attend the 1000th anniversary in 200 years from now, even though it would probably be helpful if we could rejuvenate a little bit to increase the probability of survival for the next 200 years. But seriously, why do we age? Because if you think in terms of evolution, it's the survival of the fittest, those of the strongest. If there would have been an alternative Homo sapiens who would just grow up to age 20 and then just stay at the peak of her performance, and then shouldn't like such an non-aging Homo sapiens outcompete us who get frail and weak with age? So why did not a non-aging Homo sapiens evolve? So before I speak about aging and non-aging, I should probably define what and how I measure aging. And here I talk about aging as increase in mortality with age. In order to measure mortality, it's a population level measure. So it's the number of deaths per population. So you can already see the discrepancy between the actual individual at the physiological level and my demographic definition of mortality. Here it's just a cartoon where when we are born, mortality is high, we get older, and as young children, our mortality is lowest, and then over age, mortality increases for the individual, but also at the population level. Of course, what we see at the population level depends on the population composition, but eventually on our physiology and how we change over time, and also in what environment we live. If we are living in a risky environment, of course, we have a higher risk of death than in a safe environment. Eventually, our physiology depends, of course, on our genes, and also our genes have a certain environment. So what kind of genes are expressed at what age and so on, all that changes. So if you look at this as a statistician, you can already see the complexity of data that might be involved in studying aging across all these levels of observation. So I'm going to make my life easy and say, I look at the demographic level. So simply death counts in a population over time, assuming a homogeneous population and no difference among individuals. The classic evolutionary answer to why aging evolved was given by Bill Hamilton very prominently in 1966 in a mathematical paper where he proved that aging is inevitable. So aging has to inevitably evolve because the force of selection declines with age. What happens to us later and later in age matters less and less for our evolutionary success. And here's, I think, one of two formulas that I will show, which is a favorite formula of demographers. This is the Lotka equation, and it basically sums from the age alpha, the age of maturity, to omega, the last age when everybody's dead. It sums the probability to survive from birth to age A and the reproduction at age A with a population discount factor, and says on average, every female in a population has to replace herself with a female baby. So this is even such a homogeneous population, it's only females. Okay. So this is an equation that summarizes population renewal. And this population growth rate, the intrinsic rate of population increase, is what biologists and evolutionary biologists use to measure evolutionary fitness. So that population which grows the fastest will eventually win in the course of evolution. And what Hamilton showed is that if you take the fitness sensitivity, the change in the population growth rate with respect to changes in age-specific mortality, and I'm not showing you all these formulas there, then you can see that this change in little r with respect to mortality, which is hidden in this here, probability to survive is e to the minus integral the hazard, the mortality that kills you. So if you take that age specifically, it declines with age. No matter what pattern of mortality, no matter what species you look at. Therefore, Hamilton claimed that the force of selection declines, so aging is inevitable. We all have to age. That's kind of the bad news from this 1963 paper. Okay. So my PhD thesis started with Jim Bockel, who was actually supposed to speak here today. He came to my office and he basically said, something must be wrong with this paper because in nature, we see that mortality can indeed fall with age. For example, for many plants or trees, the big trees are stronger than the small trees. So mortality falls, which would be kind of negative aging in the definition of a demographic sense, right? Mortality is falling over adult ages, negative aging. So experts were like, oh my God, that's not possible. So I set out for my PhD thesis and we developed a bunch of models together, and we could show that indeed, if you do optimization models, which I will show in a minute, you can see that there are three generic patterns of aging that could, in theory, evolve from an evolutionary perspective. So here you have the human mortality from age of maturity to the oldest age over adulthood. Our mortality increases with age, but it turns out that's only one evolutionary possibility. Another option is to follow the Hydra strategy. Hydra is a little freshwater polyp. It's like barely visible with the naked eye. And it lived in the dungeons of the Max Planck Institute in Rostock for 8 years. And they found that there was no increase in the mortality or in the fertility over age. So this Hydra just simply didn't show any signs of aging, demographically speaking, because we did not measure the physiology of these little. We were just feeding them and counting the deaths. But it is even possible to have a falling mortality pattern with age, which we observe in some turtles or tortoises. There has just been 2 science papers who show examples of that. So this is from 2012, and we showed that this can be the 3 generic patterns of mortality, increasing, constant, or decreasing with age. And if you think about the diversity of life, it's really, we should step back from the human-centric view on the life course. There are many species who have a very different life course from what we are doing. But what we all basically have is the trade-off between survival and reproduction. Either you spend your time, taking care of your survival, or you spend your time taking care of your children, and you can tell after a few nights without sleep that there is a cost. And the question is, in different species, these costs are different. If you want to increase your survival by 1 unit, the question is, how much are the marginal losses in your reproduction? Or if you want to increase your reproduction by 1 unit, how much are the marginal losses in survival? So these marginal gains and losses in survival and reproduction, they determine the optimal strategy of survival and reproduction and whether or not it's optimal to age. So if you think about that, we use, instead of putting age in the center, because we're talking about aging and change over age, age doesn't say anything. It's about your stage that you are in that actually reflects how strong you are or how healthy you are. And imagine that damage is inevitable. Everybody would agree to that. Somehow there's always some wear and tear. So that's inevitable, but repair is optional. So there could be repair and regeneration. So logically speaking, depending on how much energy you allocate to repairing, you could either have one type of aging or the other. And then it's clear if damage and wear and tear is larger than the repair, you show aging. But if they balance, there could be something like negligible aging. And if you even kind of, the overachiever, you're investing more than you need, then you show negative aging, you go better. So this was kind of the setting of these models that we developed together. And this is the second formula that I will show. It's essentially the same formula as before, just in discrete time. And you miss the population growth term here because we assume that there is no dynamics, there is no stochastic, it's all deterministic. And we say that the optimal phenotype should have a population growth rate of 0, because otherwise the world would be just exploding by this phenotype. So R is 0, so there's a d to the 0, which is 1. And we maximize his lifetime reproductive success. And then the question becomes, of course, we all start from one cell, but then we have to grow. And the question is, when do we stop growing and start investing also in reproduction? And then the question is also, how much do we invest in growth and how much do we invest in reproduction once we start this resource sharing, right? So we did all this modeling, and that was what led us to this picture. So one contribution of this work was to say, okay, we changed the question from why do we age, assuming aging is inevitable, to why do we age, but maybe some other species do not age. And why do they not age? And what does make us so special that we do age? And how special are we actually? Because there are many other species indeed do age. So, but we don't really understand why. But there was another observation here, because in these optimization models, it was clear that the decision whether or not the optimal outcome was aging, negligible aging, or negative aging did not depend on the time units. So whether you live minutes or hours or centuries, the same trade-off could lead you to negative or positive aging if you want. And therefore, I had some sort of aha moment, and I said, okay, if we really want to understand this question of aging or no aging, we have to segregate, or we have to segregate time, the time dimension of aging, from the shape of aging. So whether it goes up or down or stays the same, we have to have these 2 dimensions. Because in aging rate, it's a rate, so it's time dependent. So it's confounding time with direction. So it's theoretically motivated 2 measures, one for lifespan and one for aging measures. And that's what I call the pace shape framework. And that's actually pretty trivial. One is basically that we have kind of pace standardized shape, which I just explained. And then we have the pace dimension, which said whether you live days or years or centuries. And there is a number of papers in which we developed this mathematical framework for how to measure these dimensions. And it turns actually out that I wanted to have like a scalar measure, like a single number that tells me how much aging is there in this, how much aging is in this pattern. And it turns out that a shape value, I wanted to have it dimensionless, but they turn out to be measures of relative spread. And that is like how equal or different lifespans are in a population. And I will go into more detail there. And then pace, that's intuitive, it's in units of time or per time, and it's measures of lifespan. So let's look into this more deeply. Pace of mortality makes kind of sense, either lifespan or deaths per time unit. And then a preferable measure here is what demographers call life expectancy at initial age 0, and that's simply the average age at death. So here we have age and then the fraction of individuals dying at age X, which is we had some conditions that we wanted to be fulfilled for pace. This is the best measure that fulfills all these criteria. And then the shape of mortality is a time standardized pattern of mortality over the life course. And it turns out the preferable measures to capture the shape of aging are measures of relative inequality, relative spread. So for example, the Gini coefficient, something we call life table entropy, and the coefficient of variation. So here I would just like to give you an example for the life table entropy, because it's also intuitive. The others are also intuitive, but let's just explain why it's a helpful concept. And demographers have a concept developed also by Jim Mortel together with his PhD student Colonel de Fromo, but also goes back to Goldman and Hackert. That's called E-dagger, the life years lost at death. That means how many years of life do you on average lose when you die? So you die, and that you still had 10 years lived back. And you can calculate that very simply by the remaining life expectancy at age X. So how many life years left do you have? And then by the fraction of individuals who actually die at that age. So it's a weighted average that tells you the average years lost at age at death. So you have this E-dagger, and then if you take the ratio of life years lost of life expectancy, for example, for the all the data we have in the human mortality database, then on average in these data, you lose in 1950, 15 years of life when you die. That's long ago, 1950. And life expectancy was 60 years, 66 years. So that gives kind of a measure of aging of like a quarter roughly. So you lose a quarter of your life years when you die. And in 2010, it had reduced to only 10 years of life that you lose, but a life expectancy of almost 79. So then you only lost 13 years, 13% of your basically life expectancy. So this measure can basically tell you how much this population's age. And to illustrate that, oh yeah, so this measure we call life table entropy. You may, I don't know how you call it, but this is what we use to measure the shape of aging. And to relate it to this picture that I showed initially, for the entropy is smaller than 1 if you lose less life than you originally have. If there is a constant setting, then no matter at what time you look at, you always have the same mortality. That means you always have the same life expectancy ahead. So you always lose the same amount of years no matter when you die. And therefore they are the same. So an entropy of 1 is a benchmark case of constant mortality. And if entropy is actually larger than 1, which says a lot of disparity in lifespans, then you can see mortality is falling. So with these 3 measures, we can, in a continuous way, measure the degree of aging in different populations, measured, for example, for Homo sapiens in the same country at different times, or for any kind of non-human populations. And we've done that. And what we find is when we plot here the life expectancy and the life, the shape, life disparity, we see that here on the gray line, we see all the countries from crisis populations, Liberian slaves, Ukraine, hunger, winters, over in the middle here, hunter-gatherer populations and historical human populations, up to Nigeria, like more kind of Japan today, and here are in light blue Sweden. They all basically fall on a line. And this little orange here, that violet populations are single measures for primates, but different. So here we have an intra-species line, and this is an inter-species line. So different monkeys here, and here this is all humans. So exactly. I actually did that. Okay, I forgot. So you have here, no matter like what environmental conditions, the relationship between human lifespan and the disparity in lifespan falls on a line. So there's a very strong relationship there. And you can say, okay, you just selected the populations here, but indeed, if we take human mortality database, 49 countries and regions, and plot from 1900 to today, basically, you see that these populations basically fall on a line. So there is a very strong law of death in humans. And in fact, it does link to the exponential increasing mortality that's underlying. So this rigid linear constraint between pace and shape was published in PNAS twice, but then also recently in Nature Communications, where Fernando Corchero and Susan Alberts, they have actually a whole group of people who concentrate on primates, non-human primates, and they have them in captive conditions. They observe them in the wild for 30 years. I mean, imagine collecting all these data and counting deaths and following individuals. And what they find is here in gray, again, is the human line, but also the chimpanzees, the capuchin monkeys, the orangutan, not the orangutan, the baboon and the sifaka and gorilla. They all basically have linear relationships between pace and shape of aging. So what that means, if you look more deeply into it, is that indeed these species have a specific aging rate that is typical for that species. So the variation in different environments in aging comes from the level of mortality, but not the rate. So to look into that, if we simulate populations with a Sila model, so exponentially increasing mortality, a constant component, and an exponentially falling component, and the black dots here assume a high fixed rate of aging and changing the mortality level, while the red one is a low fixed rate of aging and changing mortality level. And the pink shows you what happens when you change the rate of aging at an intermediate level of mortality. So that means you become a different species when you change the rate of aging. And this is important because if we could, okay, I'm just summarizing that changing mortality level moves the species along the species line, and changing the rate moves species from one species to the other. So if we wanted to change our aging rate, does that mean we have to become a new species? Probably not. But it's important because if we think what population aging already today causes for problems, like for costs of the pension system and the labor market and the insurance companies and so on and so on. Like, I mean, there are so many issues, and this is just by changing the level of mortality, which we have seen for the 150 and more years that mortality has gone down and life expectancy has gone up. But what if we would change the rate of aging? Then we would live even much, much longer, and all these problems that we currently see would be just aggravated substantially. So how likely is it that this aging rate is actually fixed? These observations on aging, looking along the pace and shape of aging axis, suggests that the aging rates might be fixed for a species. So it could be hard to change the rate of aging in humans, but we cannot be sure because we don't know whether these lines will go on and how reliable these data are, because after all, each population is an observation at that time in that place. If you take the monkeys to a different place on a different diet, they will probably show a different mortality, just like me in Japan will be different from me in the US or in, whatever, in the Antarctic. So there will be different observations. I'm almost done. How am I doing in time? I'm speaking too fast. Okay, I'm almost done. So I have this. So why do we age? Why do we age and others do not age? Okay, how do we actually measure aging? We need the pace and the shape dimension. The pace and shape indeed show strong regularities of aging, which can be helpful and can be helpful to also test hypotheses. But we are always talking about mortality. But indeed, we are alive to, in order to be alive, you have to be born. So it felt a little bit like one-sided. So I extended this framework recently to fertility, first for non-human populations, because it was easier just working with the rate of reproduction. But then I came up with a more demographic idea, and I call it the born ones, die ones approach, life table relationships for fertility. And that is essentially the idea that we die once, but we also only born once. Because the problem in fertility research is that women do not necessarily have to give birth. So it's an uncertain event that might not happen, and they might give birth several times. So it's multiple events, and that is very inconvenient mathematically. It would be much nicer if you have an event that will happen for sure, and that happens only once, and it happens for everybody. And since we are all here, we have all been born, and we all have been born once. So this is a very simple idea underlying this framework, and it allows me to basically calculate the same piece-shape measures for mortality, also for fertility. And here in the fertility setting, I'm working for the pace with birth expectancy. So that's the average waiting time of a child to be born. And the waiting time is essentially from the age of the mother when she could become a mother to when she gives birth. Okay, but we can talk about that in the break if anybody is more interested. Important here for me was that if I can mirror birth and death methods, I can put them together in a shared mathematical framework, and then I can zoom out a little bit from the details of reproduction in humans and can get it more towards also other species, but maybe also to suborganismal levels. We can talk about it. And so this was the basis for an ERC consolidated grant that just starts this month. And that's where I'm connecting back to my title towards transdisciplinary demographic theory of birth and death trajectories, and also to let me just start here. So the first step here is to like a systematic search for macro level regularities in fertility, mirroring macro level regularities in mortality that we know, like these regularities that I just showed you, the linear link between mortality, between lifespan, between pace and shape. But then also, I would like to study the birth and death of collectives. And there, I mean, what you think of is the individual and the population. So a collective of individuals that forms a greater whole. And if you want to study then these births and deaths of these individuals, I'm very grateful actually to Professor Meng, who just mentioned, you know, what we consider the individual is totally arbitrary and essentially depends on your field of study. So he perfectly set the stage for this, that I'm also thinking in terms of births and deaths of individuals, where the individual can be a population of parts. And that's what is done here, but I'm here focusing on sandbox examples from demography. So studying the birth and death of couples, of households, of families, and I hope to develop a framework there, but this just started this month, so I don't have anything to show there, just I can only wave my hands, and I stop here.
Thank you, Annette, for your presentation, and now time to go on with the discussions. Stefano Mazzucco and Cinzia Mortarino, both from this department.
Okay, let me thank the organizer for inviting me to discuss this, not this works, many works, many papers by Annette. This is work that is in some sense demographic, but is I mean, peculiar also as a demographic work, but really interesting. So try to summarize. So the idea is to change the perspective from why do we age. I call it why do we age differently, or maybe we don't age or age differently with respect to other species. And the idea that has been shown of this make a distinction between the shape and the pace of aging, really interesting. And where the pace of aging is measured via life expectancy at birth, and the shape adding the lifespan disparity is related to life expectancy, of course. And then well, I was really impressed by the stroke of genius of born once and die once. It is really, and I like it because I think it's really consistent with the legacy of Jean Boppel. It's think complex and model simple. It was a great idea. And it's also great to see that to add the reproduction component to the mortality one. And as a demographer, so since the more you get, the more you want, I'm thinking, yeah, there is also another component that that makes the demographic dynamic of a population. And I start from the Lotka-Euler equation that is also always nice to see in a demographic talk, but we should remember that it assumes that the resources of population are infinite, and I think that Cinzia will be focused on that point, and also it assumes that the population are close to migration. So then it came to my mind the idea, so what is the role of migration in that sense? What is the role of, let's say, migration, also in a broad sense, interaction with other populations, I will say. And here we have the picture that Annette showed us, but there are many populations that are, of course, I looked, for example, Sweden here, and I looked at the migration rate of Sweden in the last centuries. It is varying a lot. There are several periods in where the migration rate was particularly high, also out migration and in migration. So wonder what is the role of migration, and well, difficult to say, because you know, migration. When you talk about migration, you think about pull factors and push factors, and it is easy to think that migration rates depends also from mortality, and immigration rates depends also on mortality and fertility of a population, because migration is a sort of mechanism of compensation across populations. So the Lotka-Euler equations will be then modified by the inclusion of migration. So we can assume that the growth of a population depends on the growth rate, that is the fitness of a population, but also it is a function of the growth rate, that is the migration rate. This is a simplification, of course, it's just to give the idea. So how does this fitness of a population change if we take into account migration? And more broadly, I say, yeah, we have to talk maybe not only of migration, but in terms of interaction with other populations. For example, I might be wrong, but I think that the shape of the Tarquoise mortality rates depends a lot on the interaction with predators. That is so sort of interaction with another populations. So how do we take into account the interaction with the other population, with other species? And we can think about this for all population and also for human population. Human population don't have predators apart from themselves, but different human population may interact among them through migration, but also we can think there is some work more in the field of mortality forecasting that try to put together several countries, because there is the idea of the improvement of my mortality rates of one country, then is diffused over the other populations. So you might think about the Lee and Lee model of mortality forecasting. So there is interaction among different populations, and then this is similar to what I said before, but you can think about key population and the interaction term that affect not only the fitness, but maybe also the shape of a population, not only the turquoise, but also the humans ones. The other point is the use of the life expectancy. Another point I want to make, then I will, this is all an introduction to just one question I will make today also. The life expectancy is used as a measure of the length of life, the pace of aging. And they say that this is used because it has a desirable mathematical properties, and we have seen this. But also I was thinking that the point that life expectancy is also very sensitive to infant mortality. We know that 100 century ago, the life expectancy in Italy, for example, was about 40 years. Now it's more than double, and the main effect in having a double life expectancy is due to the reduction of infant mortality. So how is infant mortality related to aging? Well, I will be back on this later, but let me show, for example, here, I'm showing two countries. This is the age distribution of death from the life tables. Hungary, 2007, Sweden, 1972. They have this approximately the same life expectancy. But of course, you see that the infant mortality of Sweden is much higher than the Hungarian one. But it's safe that the adult mortality of Sweden is anyway slightly more on the right-hand side. So the question is how the infant mortality is considered taken into account in the term of mortality. If we want, we could also find also alternative measure. It's not necessary that we want, but if we want, we could, for example, consider the model age at death that is not affected by infant mortality. In that case, we decide that infant mortality is not related with the aging, or we can take the life expectancy at a later age, excluding infant mortality, or we can take the life expectancy but estimated for a Gompertz model, and then the Gompertz model use only the age between 30 and 80 or 90, so the infant mortality is disregarded in that case. But of course, that depends if we want to rule out infant mortality from our definition of aging. So my question is, what is aging? In terms of how do we take into account the different factors? I can say maybe not biology. I cannot make a distinction of what is biological factor or not, because I'm not a biologist. You probably are better to do that, but I would say endogenous factors and exogenous factors. So exogenous factors is another population and the interaction with that, and also, oh, I'm almost done. And also the infant mortality, well, it is the environment, the context. Maybe these there are endogenous factor and exogenous as well. So do they equally contribute to aging, or we should think something different? And yeah, then I'm also curious to see what will be the relation between space and shape in reproduction, because yeah, I'm almost done. this has been already explored in the field of mortality. We have the work of many people showing that there is a close relation between lifespan disparity and longevity extension measured in several ways. So I think that this is a confirm what you find in the fixed rate of aging, but curious to see what happens in reproduction. And so thanks for your talk. It was really insightful for me, and I will curious to see what will be in the new project, the results. Thank you.
So I will start with a sentence of Annette's paper. So underlying that the focus is understanding the nature and the extent of a biological constraint. And I put the light on this biological constraint that affect the rate of aging in a way to, of course, this focus is aimed at deepening knowledge and in the end, eventually extending human lifespans. I want to connect also this to a sentence which we saw at the end of your presentation into your slide that was wondering under what condition could the rate of aging change. Let me start from the very interesting decomposition you made about pace and shape. So this decomposition is able to highlight aspects which we couldn't identify by looking at mortality per se. So it's something interesting. But at the same time, I'm wondering, okay, these are points. You mentioned the fact that if we move a population of monkeys somewhere in space or somewhere in time, we could obtain different values. Okay, and we are measuring all these points as a separate one. We are analyzing them separately as they came out from independent context. But of course, we know that human lifespan is directly connected with other species lifespan, exactly because other species may represent resources for humans and at the same time compete for the same resources, are themselves resources predators. Human lifespan and also other species lifespan at the same time depend upon natural resources, which may not be unlimited. Okay. We compete for the same space. Well, usually human versus animal, it's not a fair competition, but it is competition. And maybe I'm still borrowing your picture. Also in the paper, where you could have, of course, more space to discuss this relationship, you're trying to fit a linear model which works well between pace and shape measures. However, there are discrepancies in this model. And maybe I'm wondering whether these deviations could be due to what I can call altogether external conditions. Okay. I'm coming back to a word just being used by Stefano, okay, which is important. It is something which comes natural, interactions among species. And of course, the human effect on the environment and altogether. But in these external conditions, we have to consider also external events, which could be extreme climatic events, a war, or a pandemic, which have a very complex effect. Okay. Think about COVID-19 pandemic, which was, of course, negative for humans, but could be, it has shown to be positive for other species, which could benefit from the absence of a human in particular environments. But at the same time, it was also negative for other species, because the human intervention at some point is acting to protect species which are in danger. So we have very different effects, which could, of course, very difficultly be described. And again, limited resources. In the last 50, 60 years, the exploitment of natural resources, okay, thinking about energy, has been so intense and could give a big improvement in human lifespan. And we cannot imagine that this could happen again in the next 50 years at least not at the same rate. So I would like to think, I'm thinking about a different approach. So trying to describe in a more general way the context that we are dealing with. That is trying to treat it like a system. Okay, I'm telling you, unfeasible maybe. Okay, there is a limit we can arrive with this approach, but maybe there is an idea, a limit to tend to, because there is an old model, the logical therapy predator-prey model, which is a competition model, which was very simple, defined for two species. But we can still go ahead. It has been extended to different kind of interactions. There are contributions to more than two species, 3 species. Here, I just put a couple of examples. And often in the literature, we observe that this kind of contributions are directed to analyzing the equilibrium solutions of these systems. I'm a statistician. I like dealing with it in a different way. So I imagine what could be a system. Okay, I skip it and come back. It was just a flash. We have a complex system of finite differential equations. And I imagine it being a systematic part of a regression model. Okay, well, it's a non-linear regression model, but could be useful to extend and have a better description of the context we are in. I'll show you an example in a very different context, which is energy. These data represent yearly energy consumptions for Sweden in a long period of about 45 years. Why I'm talking about competition? Okay. Each country decide or may decide, or at least has in front of it different sources to produce energy to be used. And somehow they compete each sources of energy with other energies. In the left panel, we observe data separating coal, gas, oil, and nuclear consumptions from renewable sources consumptions. Here we have a simple example of competition between 2 different actors. The other panel, conversely, examine this data by separating out the nuclear, whose whose features are quite different both from fossil fuel and from renewables or from renewable sources. There's a debate still going on about this. Well, we come from 2 species to 3 species competing. If I come back to the same words we used up to now. Well, something which is not surprising. What we obtain is that extending the model from 2 competitors to 3 competitors, we cannot compare the 2 models, of course, because they are based on different data. We cannot use the standard goodness of fit data, but we compared the advantage of going to 3 different species instead of 2 by relying on something which is fixed, that is renewables. And we compare the 2 models in terms of forecasting accuracy in the prediction of a common element, which are renewables. Okay, not surprising, but maybe surprising the extent of the result is that by better description of the relationship between coal, gas, oil, and nuclear, renewables benefited from and could have a lesser uncertainty in forecasting. Okay, so something out of context. Maybe we should tend to improve this kind of model to a larger system by including as many details we can, because often, of course, our effort will give us a better description of the world we are living on. Thank you.
Before giving the floor to the next slide, I would ask the audience if there are also other questions.
Thank you very much. Your estimates of the pace of aging, as I understood it, are based on period life table measures. So how do they look like? Because pace of aging might look different in cohort life tables, which would refer to real populations rather than hypothetical ones. And well, I think you get some different impressions of kind of aging processes depending on looking at cohort or period. So I just wondered what difference that would make.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if the kind of the straight shape that you get between the expected life expectancy as well as this log of this ratio kind of imposes some kind of structure on the survival model. What kind of survival model that implies?
Question more?
Okay, so I start with the 2 questions from the audience because they are faster to answer. So first to the period cohort. Yes, these are period data. I do not expect a generally different trend for the cohort data, but we will check. So that one thing is my expectation. But in general, we also see a rectangularization of the survival curve for cohorts, just as we see it for period, which also comes to the second question of the underlying mortality model that may bring about this linear relationship. And there was a paper by Rao and Cohen and Rao and Christina Böck, I think 4 years ago or something. And they highlight that the underlying exponential mortality model and also the scalar mortality model, they can bring about these kind of linear trends, because you can imagine if there's an exponentially increasing mortality with age and you save a life at young age, for example, infant mortality, where do they pile up? Well, they pile up at the expected age of death. So they make this hump higher and higher, and it leads to a more and more equal lifespan. why it has to be exactly aligned. Like, so it's expected that lifespan equality increases as you save lives. At least as you save lives in younger ages. When you start saving lives at the highest ages, beyond the point of, like, there is a threshold age that there are several publications on how to calculate that, you actually increase lifespan disparity. So it could be that this linear relationship in the future might change simply because we start saving lives of very old people, which then extends disparity rather than currently compressing. So we could see some sort of temporary linear increase because we have been saving infants and then middle-aged and older, and we may or may not go past these threshold ages of saving lives. But it depends on the exponential mortality model that's underlying that. But then the question is also, why do we have exponentially increasing mortality? Which needs, again, structural models under the hood, which gets me to the next questions. Let me start with because under the hood links to the tortoise mortality, Stefano. That there is an interaction between, like, why do we see falling mortality, for example, in these tortoises, but we also see it in trees and alligators and so on. And you're completely right. A large component of that is interaction mortality. So simply when you are small and vulnerable, you will be eaten by everything around you. And as you grow bigger, you are the one eating the others, essentially. Or as a tree, you don't eat the others, but as a tree, you are overshading the other little plants and you get access to light, so you have a better chance to grow. And of course, you are also bigger and stronger so that you will not be eaten by deer or other creatures that like to eat young plants. So yes, it's not the fall in mortality that we see in these species is likely not due to a super improvement on the cellular level, or that there might be in total absence of senescence at the cellular or genetic level, but we still see the outcome, like the evolutionary consequence, you are alive or not. They are more and more likely to be alive. And for evolution, for this kind of evolutionary explanation, it just matters, are you alive or not, no matter how you did that, whether you did that by improving your internal system, or whether you just survived better because you are bigger and stronger. And for the turtles, of course, this shell protects you from predators. And the bigger you are, the harder this shell becomes. And that also works for other creatures who, for example, can fly, like the bats. Bats have much higher life expectancy than, for example, mice who have the same body size, but they live much longer. And that is thought because they can fly and thus escape predators. So there are, human beings are also pretty long-lived for their physiological size, but that's not because we can fly, but because we are very intelligent, so we can escape our predators by other means than flying. So therefore I also showed these different levels of aging. So there can be aging under the hood. As like also in plants, they grow bigger plants have more leaves. It takes longer for this big plant to die than a small plant. So, but simply, I leave that. I think the point was hopefully made. It's the same point as with a turtle, just with a plant. Interaction mortality. We actually have a paper on interaction mortality, so that there have to be several components that have to come together for you to die. You're not just kind of sitting there isolated in a vacuum and then just kind of fall apart. There are endogenous and exogenous factors. I'm very grateful that you actually made that distinction. And it has to always come together, certain external and internal factors that eventually kill you. And we use the Causal Pi Model. So where you think of that you have to have like a full pie of causes. And if the cause is present, you get this kind of piece of the pie. But this cause might also be part of another cake. Like imagine you have many cakes, and each cake, when it's full, it's killing you. And you have different parts that add to these components. And once you have a full set of components, then you will die of that particular cause of death. They can be external and internal. And how the weight is, that is very hard to say. It depends on the system, it depends on the organism. For example, if you think of of a creature that is at the top of the, like a top predator, or that has no predator to eat it in any way, what can it die of? It can die of a sudden disaster, which refers to your point, the environmental effects of like a war or a nature catastrophe, a change in the temperature of the sea, or a drought that suddenly there is no water, then anything that needs water is dead. So aging is not necessarily something that kills you, it just makes it more likely that you will die. But for some creatures, aging doesn't play a role in the life of an adult, even though under the hood it may happen, or it actually does happen. There is anecdotal evidence for a turtle in the Australian zoo. I think her name was Harriet, and she died of a heart attack at age 100, I don't know what. And there is another turtle that is still alive and is 100, I don't know, 40 years old, and then the zookeepers give her or him, I think, is Jonathan. He can't hear and he can't see and he doesn't find the food, and then they put it in front of. So there is aging in turtles. It's just the average turtle doesn't have a problem with aging normally, because they are not normally kept in zoos. Infinite resources. That's definitely a point, and we do have a very, very artificial model with, we don't include sexes, we don't include interaction with any species. We do include size as a limit to resources, even though there is kind of unlimited resources in the environment. In one model that we have, we assume that how much resources you can actually get and use depends on your body size. So the larger you are, the more sunlight you can gather, or the more you can eat, and the more you can use. So there's a limiting factor. But it points to all these factors that both of you alerted to: interaction, frequency dependence, environmental interactions. This all are model extensions or assumptions that would need to be justified for a specific species. So what is kind of frustrating with the models that I've been doing so far is that I feel I'm kind of flying arbitrarily in the sky, saying, okay, we can get these generic patterns, but I cannot connect it to specific species. I can show this human turtle Hydra thing because I know there are these observations, but I cannot take the model and actually fit it to the data. So ideally, we would have a model that is motivated by the structure of the organism, by some resource constraints in the environment, by some, let me see whether I can link it to the other things that you asked, by the exogenous and the endogenous factors, whether this is an organism that lives in a very, has a lot of predators or very few, or whether there is an organism that typically has like something to do with interacting with other species. For example, us, we have interaction with other species in our gut. There is billions and billions of bacteria and different populations of bacteria that have their competition inside our gut and help us to survive. And if the wrong guys survive, if the wrong guys win, then we have a problem. But if we, we don't have so much time. Okay, let me see. Infant mortality, a very good point. I fully agree with you that development is not aging. So infant mortality per se, it does not tell you something about aging. The measure of life expectancy at age 0 is readily generalized to life expectancy at any age. So we can just choose any starting age to define our pace of life. We would start with life expectancy at age of maturity, but there is also a question of data availability, because having the age at maturity is not trivial for many species. So then you would get, like, from this publication, you get some sort of, oh, they mature at age 3 or they mature at age 2. But if they just live 4 years, then age 2 or age 3, like, is a huge difference. So there are these considerations, but I fully agree with you that infant mortality distorts the picture. For human data, it makes sense to start at age 15 or later. Alternative measures of pace. In fact, we have listed a whole number of measures of pace, like different percentile measures of survival, like the age when 20% of people are dead, or 50, or how many. These are viable case measures. I think the modal age at death was among these, but I am not 100% sure, 80% sure. I have to check our paper. It's already 10 years ago, I think, or maybe 8. Yeah, so there are alternative pace measures that are viable, not just life expectancy at birth. Okay. What is aging? Yeah, what is aging? I already said that there are these different levels of scale, and that I measure, or demographers, comparative evolutionary biodemographers, measure aging at the population level. But when you imagine shifting the focus of what is your individual one level below and one level below and one level below, you can also study the populations of cells. And then you study the birth and death rates of populations of cells. And then from there, ideally have a network model that gives you as emergent property the mortality patterns on the level of the tissue, and then on the level of the organ, and then organ system, and eventually organism, so that you would have some sort of structural explanation for what type of levels in an organism and how they are connected eventually gives you your mortality pattern. So you would still use the population level lens, studying the population of whatever individuals at that scale, but you could zoom into the organism with that, and you could use ever more detailed data. The question is, what people collect birth and death data on all these sub-organism, what is called cells and so on. They might not necessarily measure these things that demographers would measure, because that has not been typically the question. So one of my future goals is to meet with people who study these different systems and find out who actually studies birth and death of suborganismal systems, and then use this for modeling. Let me see. There was so much. I mean, thank you so much for going in so much detail into this, into my project, which I understand is not the normal paper presented. So it must have been a lot of work, and there have been a lot of good ideas with the Lotka-Volterra model, and with taken into account interaction with kind of species and populations around you. So I will definitely look into that. It was very inspiring for me. I hope I haven't forgotten too many things to answer.